In the Black Sea resort city of Sochi, Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed the growing tensions between Moscow and Paris over the recent seizure of an oil tanker suspected of being part of Russia's so-called shadow fleet. Speaking at a forum attended by Russian officials and academics, Putin accused the French authorities of using the incident to divert their own citizens' attention away from domestic troubles. Putin said, "Is this really that important for France? It is. Do you know why? It's because of the difficult domestic political situation facing France's ruling elite, because they have no other way to distract the public, the citizens of France, from the complex, difficult-to-solve problems within the French Republic itself." Putin's remarks came amid an ongoing French investigation into a seized tanker that European authorities suspect has been involved in circumventing international sanctions on Russian oil exports. The case, widely covered by European media, has heightened tensions between Moscow and Paris at a time when relations are already strained over the war in Ukraine and Western sanctions. In his address, Putin portrayed the French action not as a matter of enforcing sanctions or maritime law, but as a deliberate political move designed to shift public focus. According to him, French leaders were seeking to rally the nation by presenting Russia as an external threat. Putin argued, the French authorities therefore really want to transfer, as I already said in my speech, the tension to the external contour to excite some other forces, other countries, for instance, Russia, to provoke us to some active actions and say to the French people, come to me, rally around me, I will lead you to victory, like Napoleon. The Russian president underscored his point by holding up a book of poetry, reading aloud an excerpt from a 19th century work by Alexander Pushkin that referenced Napoleon's dramatic appeal to the French nation during times of conflict. It was a theatrical moment in the forum that reflected Putin's frequent use of historical analogies to frame current geopolitical struggles. This dispute over the tanker is unfolding against the broader backdrop of the war in Ukraine, now in its third year. Moscow's military campaign has been met with persistent Western sanctions and support for Kyiv, while Russia continues to blame the West for the conflict's origins and ongoing bloodshed. Speaking at length about the historical roots of today's crises, Putin said, "The euphoria and unbridled thirst for power of those who considered themselves victors after the Cold War, as I have said repeatedly, led to the desire to impose one-sided, subjective notions of security on everyone. This, in fact, became the true root cause not only of the Ukrainian conflict, but also of many other acute conflicts of the 20th century and of the first decade of the 21st century. Putin's comments reflect his long-standing narrative that the West, emboldened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, ignored Russia's security concerns and pursued policies that sowed the seeds of future wars. In Moscow's view, NATO expansion and Western interventions in regions from the Balkans to the Middle East exemplify this one-sided approach to security. Addressing the current battlefield situation, the Russian president admitted that the conflict has not yet been halted, but blamed European powers for perpetuating the war rather than seeking peace. Putin remarked, "Unfortunately, it has not yet been possible to stop the hostilities, but the responsibility for this does not lie with the majority for the failure to stop. It lies with the minority, primarily Europe, which is constantly escalating the conflict. And in my opinion, no other goal is in sight today. Nevertheless, I believe that goodwill will prevail." This statement struck a note of cautious optimism, while also deflecting responsibility away from Moscow. By framing the continuation of the war as a consequence of Europe's alleged escalation, Putin sought to position Russia as being open to peace, in contrast to what he describes as Western intransigence. The remarks also highlight Russia's broader diplomatic messaging aimed at portraying Western governments as divided and distracted by internal political pressures. In Putin's telling, domestic unrest in countries like France has driven their leaders to adopt more confrontational policies toward Russia in an effort to unify their own populations. The reference to France's internal political difficulties alludes to ongoing public discontent in the country, including protests over economic reforms and controversies surrounding the government's handling of security and immigration issues. By suggesting that these domestic challenges explain France's foreign policy stance, Putin sought to delegitimize Paris's motives in pursuing the tanker investigation. For Moscow, the notion of a Western shadow fleet seizure carries symbolic as well as practical weight. Russia has increasingly relied on a network of tankers operating under obscure ownership structures and flags of convenience to transport oil despite sanctions. Any disruption to this network threatens one of the few lifelines left for Russia's sanction-hit economy. The French probe into the seized tanker, therefore, touches a nerve in Moscow, both economically and diplomatically. Putin's characterization of it as a political distraction rather than a legitimate enforcement action underscores the extent to which Russia views Western sanctions and related measures as tools of political warfare rather than legal instruments. Throughout his remarks in Sochi, Putin attempted to frame the ongoing confrontation as part of a larger historical struggle. By invoking the post-Cold War era and describing Western powers as intoxicated by victory and eager to impose their own security vision, he cast Russia as a defender of a multipolar world order against what he considers Western hegemony. The use of Pushkin's poetry and the reference to Napoleon were emblematic of this narrative strategy, drawing on national history and culture to contextualize present-day events. In doing so, Putin not only criticized France's leaders, but also sought to appeal to Russian audiences who view their country as historically resisting foreign pressure and interference. Observers note that such rhetoric also serves to shore up domestic support for Moscow's ongoing war effort by portraying Russia as a victim of Western provocation and hypocrisy. By highlighting European responsibility for the conflict and emphasizing Russia's willingness to seek peace, Putin is trying to deflect blame from his own government's decision to launch the invasion in February 2022. The speech in Sochi comes at a time when the war in Ukraine shows no sign of abating and diplomatic initiatives to end it remain stalled. Ceasefire talks have failed repeatedly, and the battlefield has seen continued destruction, with both sides digging in for a prolonged struggle. Putin's remarks were also aimed at an international audience, especially nations outside the Western bloc that have been courted by both Moscow and Kyiv. By accusing France and Europe of escalating the conflict and distracting their citizens, he sought to portray the West as unreliable and driven by short-term political needs rather than by genuine concern for global stability. In this sense, the dispute over the tanker is less about the vessel itself than about the larger contest over narratives, who is seen as responsible for prolonging the war and destabilizing the global order. For Moscow, keeping the focus on Western missteps is central to that narrative. For France and its European allies, however, the seizure of a suspected Shadow Fleet tanker is part of enforcing sanctions designed to cut off Russia's war financing. French authorities have maintained that their investigation is rooted in international law and the need to uphold sanctions rather than in any domestic political calculation. As the war in Ukraine grinds on, incidents such as this one underscore how deeply the conflict has reshaped relations between Russia and Europe. Routine maritime enforcement actions now carry political and symbolic weight far beyond their immediate implications, and each side accuses the other of bad faith. Putin's remarks in Sochi make clear that Russia will continue to resist Western narratives that portray it as the primary aggressor. Instead, Moscow will seek to position itself as both a historical and present-day defender against Western overreach. The forum where the Russian president spoke served as yet another platform for these long-standing arguments. While the remarks offered no concrete proposals for peace, they reinforced the Kremlin's message that the war's continuation is primarily the fault of Western powers. In closing his remarks on the conflict, Putin expressed a guarded hope that the future might hold an end to hostilities, but again placed the onus on Europe to change its approach. His words, "Nevertheless, I believe that goodwill will prevail," were delivered as a final note of cautious optimism amid an otherwise combative speech. For Russia's critics, such statements ring hollow in light of Moscow's ongoing military actions in Ukraine. For supporters at home and sympathetic audiences abroad, they reinforce the image of a leader who portrays himself as seeking peace while blaming others for blocking it. As the geopolitical standoff between Russia and Europe continues, the war of words remains as fierce as the military conflict on the ground. Putin's framing of the French investigation into the tanker as a mere political distraction suggests that the Kremlin intends to keep challenging Western narratives on every front: economic, diplomatic, and informational. In the end, the Sochi speech captured the essence of Russia's current approach: combine historical references and patriotic rhetoric with pointed accusations against Western leaders, and cast Russia as a steady, besieged power confronting an unstable and divided West. Whether that narrative gains traction outside Russia remains to be seen, but for now it continues to define the Kremlin's messaging both at home and abroad.